When people talk about power, they imagine something obvious: a dictator, a government, a monopoly with a name you can point to. But the most powerful systems don't look like power at all. They look like progress. More than a century ago, one industry perfected a method that changed everything, not by dominating consumers, but by making competition impossible. At first, it appeared generous. Lower prices, greater stability, predictability in a chaotic world. People didn't resist it. They welcomed it. When critics finally spoke up, the response was swift. Laws were passed. Companies were broken apart. History books declared the era over. But the truth was far more unsettling. The company was gone. The system wasn't. It had simply learned how to exist without being seen. Today, that same logic shapes your daily life. The platforms you rely on, the services you trust, the choices you think you're making. You don't feel controlled because nothing is forcing you. The system doesn't trap you with walls. It traps you with paths. And every path feels like the obvious choice. Once you recognize this pattern, modern power stops being confusing. It becomes predictable. Because the most successful systems aren't built to dominate loudly. They're built to never be questioned at all. Look around your life for a moment. The fuel in your car, the phone in your hand, the medicine in your cabinet, the bank holding your money, the platform delivering your packages, the search engine answering your questions. None of these feel connected. They look like separate choices, separate companies, separate industries. They aren't. What you're living inside isn't the aftermath of history. It's the continuation of it. The structures built in the late 1800s didn't collapse when the factories shut down or when the executives died. They didn't disappear when laws were passed or companies were renamed. They were absorbed into the foundations of modern life, quietly, legally, permanently. When you buy gasoline, you're not just buying fuel. You're stepping into a supply chain designed for total control. When you take a prescription drug, you're not just treating an illness. You're entering a medical system shaped by corporate incentives set more than a century ago. When you search the internet, shop online, or deposit your paycheck, you're moving through channels optimized for extraction, consolidation, and dominance. This isn't coincidence. It's inheritance. The past didn't end. It scaled. What Rockefeller pioneered in oil became the default logic of power across every major industry. The same methods, the same structures, the same outcomes, only faster, quieter, and wrapped in convenience. What once required railroads and refineries now runs on algorithms, logistics networks, and legal frameworks you never see. You're told you have choices, brands, platforms, providers. But those choices sit on top of the same foundation. You don't notice the system controlling you because it doesn't feel like control. It feels normal. And the most effective systems always do. You don't see the system because you were born inside it. John D. Rockefeller wasn't born into power. There was no empire waiting for him, no inheritance, no elite connections shaping his future. What he inherited instead was something far more important, a way of seeing the world. Rockefeller was born in 1,839 inches, rural New York, to two completely opposite forces. His father, William Avery Rockefeller, was a traveling salesman, a con man who sold fake cancer cures and disappeared for long stretches of time. He taught young John that people could be manipulated, that trust was a tool, and that morality was flexible if the outcome benefited you. His mother, Eliza Rockefeller, was the opposite. Deeply religious, disciplined, certain. She believed God rewarded order, thrift, and hard work. Waste was a sin. Chaos was a moral failure. Those two influences fused into something dangerous. From his father, Rockefeller learned ruthlessness without guilt. From his mother, he learned that success could be righteous. That domination could be justified if it produced order. This wasn't greed. This was belief. Rockefeller didn't see business as competition between equals. He saw it as a moral obligation to organize disorderly markets into something efficient and controlled. If weaker businesses failed, that wasn't cruelty. That was proof they didn't deserve to exist. Even as a teenager, Rockefeller tracked every penny he earned, every expense, every inefficiency. He believed waste was immoral and efficiency was divine. So when he entered business, he didn't ask how to win. He asked how to eliminate uncertainty. And that question would shape the modern economy. Because when someone believes God wants them to control the system, resistance stops looking like opposition and starts looking like sin. In 1859, oil was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania. What followed wasn't progress, it was chaos. Thousands of prospectors flooded into western Pennsylvania almost overnight. They drilled wherever they could. Fortunes were made in weeks and lost just as fast. Prices collapsed, then spiked. Supply surged, then vanished. Nobody planned. Nobody coordinated. Everyone chased the same thing at the same time. It looked like opportunity. But Rockefeller saw something else. He saw instability. Drilling was gambling. One lucky strike could make you rich, one dry hole could ruin you. The entire industry depended on chance, weather, speculation, and rumor. Prices were violent. Markets were irrational. Businesses appeared and vanished before they could mature. To most people, this chaos meant excitement. To Rockefeller, it meant weakness. He understood something others didn't. The real power in a chaotic system doesn't belong to the risk-takers. It belongs to the organizers. Not the people who search for resources, but the people who control what happens after they're found. Rockefeller wasn't interested in drilling oil. He didn't want to gamble on luck. He wanted certainty. So while others chased wells, he focused on refining the quiet, unglamorous process of turning crude oil into something usable, kerosene for lamps, a product people needed every day, regardless of boom or bust. Refining wasn't exciting, but it was predictable, and predictability is power. Rockefeller realized that chaos didn't need to be defeated. It needed to be enclosed, stabilized, controlled. Whoever could impose order on a disorderly market wouldn't just survive the oil rush. They would own it. He didn't see oil. He saw inefficiency. And inefficiency, to Rockefeller, was an invitation. Rockefeller's first real weapon didn't look like a weapon at all. It looked like efficiency. Most oil businesses at the time focused on a single step. Drill the oil, refine the oil, transport the oil, sell the oil. Each stage was handled by someone different, each taking a cut, each adding cost, each creating dependency. Rockefeller decided that was the mistake. Instead of competing inside the system, he began to absorb the system itself. He didn't just refine oil. He bought the barrel factories so he wouldn't have to pay barrel makers. He purchased tank cars so he didn't have to rent transportation. He secured warehouses so he didn't have to rely on third-party storage. He built distribution networks so he could sell directly to the market. Every cost his competitors paid to someone else became internal to him. This was vertical control. Imagine a ladder where every rung generates profit. Rockefeller didn't stand on one rung. He owned the ladder. The result wasn't just lower costs, it was asymmetry. While competitors paid 25 cents for a barrel, Rockefeller produced his own for 15. While others paid railroads full price, Rockefeller negotiated secret rebates. In some cases, the railroads paid him to ship oil and charged his competitors more to move the same product. This wasn't illegal at the time. It was legal, invisible, devastating. Rockefeller could sell kerosene cheaper than anyone else and still make money. His competitors couldn't match the price without losing everything. To outsiders, it looked like fair competition. Better prices, better efficiency, but what was really happening was enclosure. Every independent profit stream in the industry was being pulled inward. Every external dependency was being eliminated. Rockefeller wasn't racing other companies. He was slowly sealing them inside a system they couldn't escape. He wasn't competing, he was enclosing. Once Rockefeller had control over costs, the next step was inevitable. Eliminate the competition. This is where the system revealed its second function. Not efficiency, not innovation, endurance. Rockefeller didn't need to win every sale. He just needed to survive longer than everyone else. In 1872, in Cleveland, Ohio, he put this principle into action in what would later be called the Cleveland Massacre. Over a period of just a few months, Rockefeller approached nearly every independent refinery owner in the city. His offer was simple: sell to Standard Oil at a fair price and keep a comfortable position inside the system. Most understood the message. Those who refused learned the alternative. Rockefeller slashed kerosene prices below the cost of production. Not just for a day, not just for a week, for as long as it took. His competitors hemorrhaged money on every sale. They couldn't match his prices without going bankrupt. They couldn't raise prices without losing customers. They were trapped. This wasn't competition, it was attrition. Rockefeller could bleed longer because his system absorbed the loss. Vertical control gave him reserves. Scale gave him patience. Time became a weapon. One by one, refineries collapsed. Some sold in desperation. Others shut their doors permanently. By the end of the campaign, Rockefeller controlled 25 of Cleveland's 26 refineries. Choice didn't disappear all at once. It was suffocated. This strategy had a pattern. First, offer to buy. If they refuse, undercut until survival becomes impossible. Then buy what's left. The ruins are cheaper. This method would be repeated in industry after industry for the next century and a half. Different names, different technologies, same outcome. Sell to him or starve. By the late 1872, Rockefeller was no longer just winning battles. He was rewriting the map. Standard Oil expanded far beyond Cleveland. Refineries in New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, all absorbed into the same structure. The same tactics repeated everywhere. Vertical control to lower costs. Price wars to eliminate resistance. Quiet buyouts to consolidate what remained. The numbers became difficult to comprehend. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled around 90% of America's oil refining capacity. 90%. That isn't a successful business. That's a monopoly. At that scale, competition doesn't function. Markets don't self-correct. Prices don't reflect choice. One decision at the top ripples through the entire economy. Energy, lighting, transportation, all flowed through a single system. What made this moment dangerous wasn't just size. It was inevitability. Rockefeller didn't need to innovate anymore. He didn't need to race competitors. He didn't even need to watch them closely. The system itself did the work. Anyone who entered the market faced the same math: higher costs, lower margins, eventual failure. This wasn't luck. It was design. And the public noticed. Newspapers called Rockefeller a tyrant, a robber baron, the most hated man in America. Small businesses collapsed, prices were controlled, power was concentrated beyond anything the country had seen before. For the first time, the question wasn't whether Rockefeller was too powerful. It was whether anyone could stop him. This wasn't success. This was dominance. As Rockefeller's control tightened, the country pushed back. Journalists began digging. Politicians began listening. And for the first time, the system faced resistance from outside the market. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. On paper, it was simple. Monopolies were illegal. Any company that restrained trade or crushed competition could be broken apart. For the public, this felt like justice finally catching up. Investigative journalists like Ida Tarbell exposed how Standard Oil really operated. Secret railroad rebates, predatory pricing, deals made in back rooms. The illusion of fair competition shattered. Public anger exploded. To the outside world, this looked like the beginning of the end. But Rockefeller wasn't surprised. He had never believed power could survive if it was visible. He understood that the moment control is obvious, it becomes a target. So while regulators were still learning how monopolies worked, Rockefeller was already redesigning the system that made his power possible. He didn't fight the law head on. He stepped around it. Because laws target companies, they don't target methods. And Rockefeller's real power was never tied to a single company name. It was tied to structure, to ownership, to control without exposure. By the time the government decided to act, Standard Oil was already something else entirely, something harder to define, something harder to dismantle. The public believed the law had arrived just in time, but Rockefeller was already ahead. The solution Rockefeller's lawyers designed didn't look like resistance. It looked like compliance. In 1882, Standard Oil quietly transformed itself into something new, not a company, a trust. On the surface, nothing changed. Oil was still refined, kerosene was still sold, railroads still moved tank cars across the country. But legally, Standard Oil of Ohio no longer controlled anything directly. Instead, the shares of dozens of separate oil companies were handed over to a small group of trustees, 41 men, almost all of them Rockefeller and his closest associates. The companies still existed, the names still appeared on paper, but the power flowed upward, into a single invisible structure. This was control without ownership. The trust didn't drill, it didn't refine, it didn't sell, it simply owned the owners. Decisions were centralized. Profits were consolidated, risk was dispersed, and regulators were left chasing shadows. To the law, these were independent companies. In reality, they moved as one. This was the moment Rockefeller stopped building a monopoly and started building a system. A model that could survive regulation, geography, and public outrage. A structure that could expand across state lines while technically obeying state laws. It worked perfectly. Other industries copied it immediately. Sugar, tobacco, steel, railroads. The trust became the template for corporate America. Over time, it evolved into something even more familiar. The holding company. A parent that owns subsidiaries. A center of gravity that controls without appearing to act. If this sounds modern, it should. Because today's corporate giants use the same structure. Different names, same logic. Alphabet owns Google, YouTube, and dozens of other entities. Berkshire Hathaway owns entire industries without producing anything itself. Power is separated from production. Control is shielded from accountability. The company disappeared. The control didn't. When the Supreme Court finally ruled in 1911 that Standard Oil was an illegal monopoly, the decision was framed as a victory. The trust would be dismantled. The company would be broken apart into 34 separate firms. Competition would be restored. The system, people believed, had been defeated. On paper, it looked decisive. In reality, it was Rockefeller's greatest win. Because while the company was broken up, Rockefeller himself wasn't removed. He still owned shares in every single one of the new companies. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of California, Standard Oil of Indiana, different names, same ownership. What regulators didn't fully understand was that breaking a monopoly into pieces doesn't destroy power if the pieces are still connected at the top. Once the companies were separated, something unexpected happened. They were forced to compete with each other, to innovate, to expand, to grow. And, as they did, the combined value of Rockefeller's holdings exploded. Before the breakup, Standard Oil stock traded around $600 per share. After the breakup, the combined value of the new companies exceeded $2,000 per share. Rockefeller's wealth didn't shrink. It multiplied. The man regulators tried to punish became even richer than before. Not because he cheated the system, but because the system responded exactly as it was designed to. Competition at the surface. Consolidation at the core. What was supposed to be an ending became an upgrade. The monopoly didn't die. It shed its skin. And in doing so, it proved something far more dangerous than raw power. That the system could survive its own destruction. The breakup didn't end the system. It perfected it. After the breakup, history books moved on. They tell the story as if Standard Oil ended in 1911, as if the danger was contained and the lesson learned. But systems don't disappear when names change. They adapt. The companies born from Standard Oil didn't scatter into obscurity. They regrouped. They grew. They merged. Over decades, many of them quietly stitched themselves back together. Standard Oil of New Jersey became Exxon. Standard Oil of New York became Mobil. Decades later, Exxon and Mobil merged, recreating one of the largest oil companies on Earth. Standard Oil of California became Chevron. Standard Oil of Indiana became Amoco, later absorbed by BP. The fragments didn't compete themselves out of existence. They reconsolidated. What looked like fragmentation was actually strategic retreat. The system pulled back just enough to avoid regulation, then expanded again under new names. Like a living organism, it responded to threat by changing shape, not by surrendering power. This is how durable systems survive. They don't resist pressure directly, they reroute around it. By the late 20th century, the oil industry once again rested in the hands of a few dominant players: ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, Shell. Not one monopoly, but an oligopoly, fewer targets, less scrutiny, the same control. And this pattern didn't stay in oil. It spread. Industries watched what happened to Standard Oil and learned the lesson. Don't make your power obvious, don't centralize too visibly, fragment when forced, recombine when safe. You thought it was over. But the system was just getting better. If you want to see Rockefeller's system alive today, you don't need to look at oil. You need to look at Amazon. Amazon didn't start as a monopoly. It started as an online bookstore. Small, harmless, convenient. Just like Standard Oil once started as a single refinery. But Jeff Bezos didn't build Amazon to compete inside existing markets. He built it to surround them. Warehouses replaced refineries. Logistics replaced railroads. Data replaced secret rebates. But the logic stayed the same. Amazon didn't just sell products. It built the infrastructure that selling required. Fulfillment centers, delivery fleets, cloud servers, payment systems, advertising networks. Each layer absorbed what used to be someone else's profit. This is vertical integration in its modern form. Amazon controls how products are stored, how they move, how they're discovered, and how they're delivered. Sellers depend on Amazon not just for customers, but for survival. Leaving the platform often means disappearing entirely. And then there's horizontal consolidation. Amazon buys competitors when it can. Whole Foods, Zappos, Twitch, Ring, MGM Studios. Entire industries pulled inside the same system. When it can't buy a competitor, it studies them. Third-party sellers are required to share sales data. Amazon analyzes what works, then launches its own version under Amazon Basics. It undercuts prices, promotes itself, squeezes margins. Legally, efficiently, devastatingly. Just like Rockefeller, Amazon can afford to lose money where others can't. Scale gives it patience. Infrastructure gives it leverage. Time becomes the weapon. This isn't innovation. It's enclosure. Different century. Same method. Amazon shows how the system controls physical goods. Google shows how it controls reality itself. When you search for something online, it feels free, instant, neutral, helpful. You don't hand over cash, so it doesn't feel like a transaction. But it is. Google controls over 90% of global search. That's more dominance than Standard Oil ever had at its peak. The difference is that Rockefeller charged money. Google charges attention and data. You don't pay with dollars. You pay with behavior. Every search trains the system. Every click feeds it. Every habit strengthens the moat. And because the service is free, regulators hesitate. How do you call something a monopoly when consumers aren't being charged? Rockefeller would have loved this innovation. A monopoly so complete that the users don't even realize they're paying. Pharmaceutical companies use the same playbook in a different form. They don't just sell drugs. They shape the rules that decide which drugs exist. Regulations, patents, approvals, all written with heavy industry input. The companies being regulated help design the regulations themselves. That's regulatory capture. It's not corruption in a dark room. It's policy influence in plain sight. User fees fund regulators. Lobbyists draft language, patents are extended, competition is delayed, and by the time a cheaper alternative appears, the market is already locked in. Choice, becomes illusion. You can pick between brands, but not between systems. Search engines, social platforms, medicines, they look competitive on the surface. Underneath, they follow the same structure. Consolidated control, high barriers, legal protection. You're told you're the customer. You're not. You're the resource. Rockefeller's most misunderstood invention wasn't in oil. It was charity. In 1913, he created the Rockefeller Foundation and poured hundreds of millions of dollars into it. Hospitals, universities, medical research, public health. To the public, it looked like redemption. The ruthless monopolist had become a benevolent benefactor. But the foundation wasn't an apology. It was an upgrade. The foundation allowed Rockefeller to move wealth out of taxable estates and into permanent institutions he still influenced. It gave him control over which universities received funding, which research paths were rewarded, and which ideas were treated as legitimate. It didn't just support knowledge, it shaped it. Medical schools that received Rockefeller funding adopted a pharmaceutical-based model of treatment. Research prioritized drugs over holistic care. Universities aligned curricula with the interests of industrial medicine. This wasn't secret, it was documented. Structured, systemic. Philanthropy became power without ownership. The man once hated as a robber baron was rebranded as a humanitarian. Criticism softened, legacy hardened. Influence outlived the company itself. And once again, others copied the model. Today, nearly every billionaire follows the same path. Massive foundations, global initiatives, policy influence wrapped in generosity. The Gates Foundation shapes global health priorities. The Chan Zuckerberg Initiative influences education and research. These institutions don't run governments. They guide them. Power that looks like generosity lasts the longest. Because it doesn't trigger resistance. It earns gratitude. And gratitude is far more durable than fear. At this point, the system can feel abstract. Big companies, big structures, big history. So bring it back to your life. You wake up and check your phone. The device, the operating system, the app store, the cloud, all controlled by a handful of corporations built on the same structural logic. You commute to work using fuel refined, distributed, and priced by companies descended from Standard Oil. You buy groceries delivered through logistics networks that decide which sellers survive and which disappear. You search, message, stream, and scroll on platforms owned by the same few entities, harvesting the same data, feeding the same machines. You feel like you're choosing. You're not. You're selecting between branches of the same tree. Even when you try to opt out, the system closes around you. Avoid one platform and another fills the gap. Pay more for an alternative and you're punished with inconvenience. Try to live off the grid and you discover how deeply the grid is embedded into work, healthcare, transportation, and social life. This isn't coercion by force. It's dependence by design. The system doesn't need to chase you. It waits. It makes itself cheaper, faster, easier, more reliable than any alternative. And over time, resistance becomes exhausting. Not because people are weak, but because the structure is efficient. Every dollar you spend flows upward through layers you never see. Fees, margins, interest, data, attention. Individually small, collectively enormous. The extraction isn't dramatic. It's routine. That's why it's so hard to notice. There is no single villain, no switch to flip, no clean exit. The system doesn't trap you with walls. It traps you with paths. Every road leads back. At this point, it would be easy to call the system evil, to frame it as exploitation, to say it's broken. But that would miss the most uncomfortable truth. The system works. Vertical integration lowers costs. When one company controls the entire supply chain, inefficiencies disappear. Prices drop. Delivery gets faster. Products become more reliable. Rockefeller's Standard Oil didn't just make him rich, it made kerosene affordable. Before his system, lighting fuel was expensive and inconsistent. After it, prices collapsed by more than 80%. That wasn't theft. That was efficiency. The same logic applies today. Amazon delivers products in days, sometimes hours. Google answers questions instantly. Pharmaceutical giants produce drugs at a scale that saves millions of lives. The system delivers real value to ordinary people. Convenience isn't fake. Innovation isn't imaginary. That's what makes the trap so effective. Because when something works, you stop questioning it. The danger isn't failure. It's concentration. When efficiency and control grow together, wealth doesn't spread. It funnels. The benefits flow outward in small, visible ways, cheaper prices, faster service, while the profits accumulate upward, quietly, relentlessly. You get convenience. They get permanence. And over time, the system becomes too big to challenge without breaking what people depend on. Regulators hesitate. Consumers adapt. Alternatives disappear. What started as a solution hardens into a structure. Efficiency becomes justification. And justification becomes protection. That's why the system survives backlash. That's why it outlives its creators. It doesn't present itself as domination. It presents itself as progress. Efficiency is the trap. Once you see the system clearly, the question becomes unavoidable. What do you do about it? There are only three real paths forward. The first is acceptance. You acknowledge that consolidation is not an accident, but the natural outcome of advanced capitalism. You use the system because resisting it costs more than it saves. You buy from Amazon because it's cheaper. You use Google because it's faster. You accept that wealth will concentrate and that efficiency will always be rewarded. This path is comfortable, but it comes with a quiet trade-off: dependence. The second path is resistance. You try to fight the system. You support antitrust laws. You buy from small businesses even when it's inconvenient. You choose alternatives even when they're worse. You vote for politicians who promise to break monopolies. This path is moral, but exhausting. You're swimming upstream against structures designed to outlast outrage, and even small victories are temporary. The third path is understanding and positioning. You accept that escape is impossible, but blindness is optional. You learn how the system concentrates wealth, and you place yourself where the concentration flows. You don't confuse liking the system with recognizing it. You stop pretending it will disappear and start treating it like gravity. This isn't about worshiping corporations or surrendering values. It's about pattern recognition. Rockefeller didn't fight the system of his time. He mastered it. He owned the extractors while everyone else paid into them. The system doesn't care whether you love it or hate it. It only responds to how you move within it. The system doesn't care what you believe. Rockefeller wasn't the only powerful man of his era. Andrew Carnegie built steel. Cornelius Vanderbilt built railroads. J.P. Morgan built financial empires. Each of them reshaped America in their own way. And when they died, their companies lived on. But their control didn't. Carnegie sold his empire. Vanderbilt's railroads fragmented. Morgan's personal dominance faded as partners and institutions took over. Their power was attached to them as individuals. Rockefeller's wasn't. Because Rockefeller didn't just build companies. He built structures, and structures don't die when people do. Standard Oil was broken up. Rockefeller died in 1937. And yet the system he designed became stronger after both events. Vertical integration became standard practice. Trusts evolved into holding companies. Regulatory capture became lobbying. Philanthropy became foundations. Every piece of his blueprint was absorbed into law, finance, and governance. This is why the pattern keeps repeating. Every generation believes it's facing something new. A new tech giant, a new monopoly, a new crisis of power. But the responses are always the same. Breakups, fines, regulations. And then, quietly, adaptation, reorganization, reconsolidation. The system doesn't resist pressure by fighting it. It survives by changing shape. That's why the number of dominant companies keeps shrinking. 3 to 5 players in every major industry: oil, banking, technology, pharmaceuticals, media. The barriers to entry rise. Competition thins. Control hardens. This isn't a phase. It's an end state. And once a system reaches that stage, it doesn't reverse on its own. It only becomes more efficient, more invisible, and more entrenched. This pattern isn't ending. By the time John D. Rockefeller died in 1937, he had lived long enough to see his company broken apart, his wealth multiply, and his methods spread far beyond oil. He built something that outlived him. Not a corporation, not a fortune, a system. A system based on vertical control, horizontal consolidation, regulatory influence, and legitimacy disguised as generosity. A system that rewards efficiency, punishes fragmentation, and concentrates power until competition becomes impractical, then impossible. Today, that system is the modern economy. You live inside it when you buy fuel, when you shop online, when you search the internet, when you visit a doctor, when you deposit your paycheck. You don't need to believe in it. You don't need to approve of it. You participate whether you want to or not. Understanding this doesn't free you. But not understanding it guarantees you'll be extracted from, without realizing how. Rockefeller's greatest achievement wasn't becoming the richest man in history. It was building a structure so effective that it no longer needs a single owner. It runs itself. It trains its successors. It absorbs resistance and converts it into fuel. Once you see the system, you can't unsee it. You'll start recognizing the pattern everywhere, in every industry, in every merger, in every choice that doesn't feel like one. And that awareness is the first real advantage most people never get. If you can see the system, you're already ahead, and that changes everything.